Ethan Reynolds had always believed that comfort meant happiness. He had built a steady life, a quiet home in suburban Ohio, a stable marketing job, and a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. But lately, everything felt like a movie he'd seen too many times. The same early mornings, the same tired dinners, the same words repeated out of habit instead of love. His wife, Claire, was kind and responsible, but they had stopped really seeing each other. Conversations had turned into reminders, grocery lists, bills, chores. Even laughter had become rare, replaced by the dull silence of routine. It was a gray Friday afternoon when the first spark appeared. Rain pressed against the office windows as the team gathered in the break room. Coffee cups clinked, and the tired laughter of the week filled the air. Ethan leaned against the counter, his mind already at home, planning another quiet weekend. That's when she walked in Melissa Jordan, the new creative consultant. She was confident but not loud, stylish but not showy, with a calm energy that drew people in. She was the kind of woman who seemed to carry her own light, as the group joked about weekend plans. Melissa looked at Ethan with a teasing smile and said, "You look like a man who forgot how to breathe. Come on, Reynolds, take 5. Let's grab a coffee downstairs." Everyone laughed, thinking it was a casual dare. Ethan smiled politely, about to refuse, but something in her voice made him pause. 5 minutes, he said finally, almost surprising himself. They stepped outside. The air smelled like rain and fresh pavement. The coffee shop across the street was warm and cozy, the kind of place where strangers talked easily. Melissa ordered a cappuccino. Ethan got black coffee. They sat by the window, and for the first time in months, Ethan didn't feel like an invisible man in his own story. Melissa wasn't like anyone at the office. She asked about things that didn't involve deadlines or marketing reports. "What do you actually love doing?" she asked. Ethan thought for a second, realizing how long it had been since someone had asked him that. "Photography," he said finally. "I used to take pictures everywhere, road trips, little things that caught my eye. I guess I just stopped, then start again," Melissa said, her voice soft but firm. "Don't let life turn you into someone who only works and sleeps." Her words hit him like a quiet truth. He hadn't realized how much he missed being himself. The version of Ethan who noticed sunsets, who made Claire laugh, who believed that love was an adventure. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost that man. They talked for half an hour, though it felt like 5 minutes. When he returned to the office, his coworkers teased him, but he just smiled. He hadn't done anything wrong. It was just coffee. Just a conversation. But something about that small moment stayed with him. The sound of her laugh. The way she listened like she actually cared that night. At home, Ethan tried to tell Claire about it, not about Melissa, but about wanting to live again. "Maybe we should plan a little trip," he said. "Just us. Remember those road trips we used to take?" Claire barely looked up from her phone. "We'll see," she said. "Work's been crazy. Maybe next month." He nodded, trying not to feel disappointed. But when he lay in bed later, her phone still glowing beside her, he stared at the ceiling and thought about Melissa's words. "Don't let life turn you into someone who only works and sleeps." The following week, Melissa passed by his desk and said, "Still thinking about that 5-minute break?" Ethan grinned. "Maybe I should have taken 10. "Careful," she said with a playful look. "You might start enjoying life again." It became a small routine. A quick chat at lunch. A shared laugh over bad office coffee. Melissa was easy to talk to, and Ethan found himself looking forward to those small moments. Not because of attraction, at least. That's what he told himself, but because he felt seen. Claire, meanwhile, was distant, without meaning to be. She was working long hours, stressed about bills, family, and everything in between. She didn't notice the small changes in him, how he smiled at his phone when a message came in, or how he started dressing better for work. She just assumed he was trying to look more professional one evening. While working late, Ethan and Melissa sat side by side going through slides for a presentation. The office was quiet except for the hum of the computer. Melissa leaned back and said softly, "You're too good to be living half a life, Ethan." He turned toward her, unsure what to say. The way she said his name felt personal, too personal. Too personal. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two people who hadn't planned to cross a line but suddenly found themselves standing on its edge. Ethan broke the silence. "Maybe I just forgot how to live fully." "Then remember," she said, smiling faintly, "take 5 again. For yourself this time." That night, Ethan drove home through the rain, the radio playing softly. He thought about his life, not what it was, but what it used to be. When he walked inside, Claire was folding laundry, exhausted. She smiled briefly. "Hey, you're late." "Long day?" "Yeah," he said, hesitating. "Just a lot of work." They talked for a bit, but neither really heard the other. They were two good people slowly drifting apart, and neither wanted to admit it. Days turned into weeks. The 5 minutes became a quiet connection, a friendship filled with laughter, shared stories, and small looks that said more than words could. They never touched, never crossed a physical line. But something emotional had started, something both thrilling and terrifying at home. Ethan started taking out his old camera. He'd walk around the neighborhood, taking pictures of empty streets and fading sunsets. It felt like breathing again. Claire noticed once, "You're into photography again?" she asked. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's nice," she replied without looking up. It was such a small moment. But it felt huge, a reminder of how distant they had become. One morning, as Ethan poured coffee in the office kitchen, Melissa appeared beside him. "You look lighter," she said. "Happier." "Maybe I am," he said honestly. She smiled. "See what happens when you take 5? He laughed. "You should stop saying that. It's starting to sound dangerous." She tilted her head. "Maybe that's the point." Her words lingered long after she walked away. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He knew he was walking a line, and yet he couldn't bring himself to step back. Melissa wasn't a mistake. She was a reflection of what he missed. Excitement. Conversation, being seen. But guilt followed close behind. He thought of Claire, of their quiet home, of the years they had built together. He loved her, he did. But love, he realized, wasn't always enough to keep people connected. The next day, Melissa invited him for lunch outside the office. "Just food," she said with a grin. "No rules, no guilt." 5 minutes, right? He agreed. They talked about everything, dreams, regrets, the strange ache of growing older. Ethan found himself opening up more than he had in years. She listened without judgment, and for that hour, the world outside didn't exist. But as they walked back, something changed. Melissa stopped and said, "You don't have to say it, Ethan. I know." He looked at her, startled. "Know what?" She smiled sadly. "That this means something to you, too." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to deny it, to call it harmless, but he couldn't. Because in that moment, it wasn't about romance or betrayal. It was about feeling alive again that night. He came home to find Claire asleep on the couch, the TV still on. He covered her with a blanket and stood there quietly, watching her breathe. He remembered the girl who used to dance in the kitchen, who used to make him laugh until he cried. He whispered softly, "Where did we go?" But there was no answer. He knew something was changing, something he couldn't fully control. And though he hadn't crossed a line yet, he could feel the pull of it. It had all started with a dare. "Take 5, she'd said. And he did, but 5 minutes had turned into something much deeper. Something that would soon test everything he believed about love, loyalty, and himself. The following week came with unexpected warmth. The air in Ohio carried the first signs of spring. Soft sunlight, the smell of wet grass, the sound of life returning. But inside Ethan's heart, there was a storm. He tried to convince himself that what he shared with Melissa was nothing, just a friendship that made work more bearable. Yet deep down, he knew it was something more dangerous, an emotional escape at home. Nothing seemed different, but everything felt different. Claire still greeted him with her usual tired smile, still talked about her long hours at work, still fell asleep early with her laptop on the bed. But now Ethan felt a quiet distance growing, like a wall that kept getting taller between them. He wanted to talk to her, to tell her he missed them, but every time he tried, she was distracted or too exhausted to listen. So he stopped trying. Work became his refuge. Melissa was there, bright, alive, always saying the right thing at the right time. She noticed the little things no one else did. When he changed his haircut, she smiled and said, "That's better. You finally look like yourself again." When he stayed late, she brought him coffee without being asked. It was small gestures like that, simple, harmless moments, that made Ethan's heart ache in ways he couldn't explain. One Thursday afternoon, as the office emptied, Melissa came to his desk holding 2 paper cups. "You owe me lunch," she said. Ethan laughed. "For what?" "For saving you from that terrible coffee you always drink." He grinned and gave in easily. They drove to a small diner just outside town, a quiet place with checkered floors and old rock music playing softly in the background. It felt strange sitting there with her, away from the world they both belonged to. For the first time, they weren't coworkers. They were just 2 people, talking like they'd known each other for years. She told him about her past, how she'd been married once, young and hopeful, and how it ended when they both realized love wasn't enough without honesty. There was no bitterness in her voice, only calm acceptance. "You learn," she said. "You learn that sometimes the person who breaks your heart teaches you who you are." Ethan listened quietly, thinking about his own life. He thought of Claire, the woman who had once been his best friend, his confidant, the one who believed in him when no one else did. And yet, somewhere along the way, they had stopped learning each other. When Melissa asked, "Are you happy?" the question hit him harder than he expected. He didn't answer. She didn't push him to. Instead, he looked out the window and said softly, "You don't have to be lonely just because you're loyal." The drive back to the office was quiet. Ethan couldn't stop replaying her words in his head. He wasn't doing anything wrong, at least not yet, but guilt had already started to whisper. That night, Claire noticed something different about him. "You seem distracted lately," she said. He forced a smile. "Just tired." "Work's been intense," she nodded, believing him. She didn't ask more. And that silence hurt more than any argument ever could. Days passed. Their connection deepened in ways words couldn't describe. They started working late more often, sharing jokes no one else understood, finishing each other's sentences. It was never physical, not once. But it was intimate, emotional, and real. Sometimes that kind of closeness is more dangerous than anything else. One evening, after a long meeting, the 2 of them ended up in the parking lot, standing beside their cars under the soft yellow lights. The air was cool, the world quiet. Melissa looked at him and said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" He looked down, unsure how to respond. "Every day," he admitted. She stepped closer, her voice low and calm. "You don't have to keep pretending, Ethan. You deserve to be happy." He met her eyes, and in that moment it felt like the world had paused. There was nothing romantic said, nothing inappropriate done, yet the silence between them was full of unspoken feelings. He could feel his heart racing, his mind screaming to turn away. But before he could speak, Melissa broke the moment with a soft smile. "Good night, Ethan." He watched her leave, his chest heavy with emotions he didn't want to name. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his car outside his own house, staring at the porch light Claire had left on. The woman inside had been his home for years. And yet, he felt like a stranger knocking on his own door. He thought about the early days, how they used to cook together, stay up late talking about their dreams, laugh over small things. Those moments had faded slowly, quietly, until only memories were left. When he finally went inside, Claire was asleep. He kissed her forehead, whispered goodnight, and promised himself he would fix things. But he didn't know where to start. The next morning, he walked into the office, determined to put distance between himself and Melissa. But when he saw her smile, warm, genuine, understanding, all his resolve melted. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. Sometimes silence says everything. Weeks passed, and their connection became something they both depended on, not for passion, but for peace. Ethan found himself confiding in her about things he couldn't tell Claire. She listened without judgment, and for the first time in a long time, he felt heard. But it wasn't one-sided. Melissa had her own loneliness, her own quiet heartbreaks. They became each other's safe place, to people standing in the wreckage of their own separate lives, finding comfort in the understanding they couldn't find elsewhere. Then one day it happened. A Friday afternoon. Rain again, just like the first time. They were reviewing a project together in her office when the power went out. The world went still, the hum of the computers fading into silence. They both laughed at first. But then, in that dim light, something shifted. Melissa looked at him and said softly, "You remember the first day we talked? When I told you to take 5?" He nodded. "Yeah, hard to forget." She smiled sadly. "I think we both took more than 5 minutes, didn't we?" He didn't answer. She took a deep breath. "Ethan, I don't want to be the reason you regret your life." He looked at her, guilt heavy in his chest. "You're not." "Then go home," she said gently. "Go fix it." He hesitated. "And what about us?" Melissa smiled, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "There shouldn't be an us, not like this." Before he could say another word, she turned away, pretending to look at her laptop even though it was still off. That evening, Ethan drove home in silence. The rain fell harder, blurring the lights outside his windshield. For the first time in weeks, he didn't think about Melissa's laughter or her voice. He thought about Claire, about the promises he had made years ago when love was new. When he entered the house, Claire was sitting by the fireplace, her face tired but kind. "Hey," she said softly, "you're home early." Ethan sat down beside her, unsure where to begin. "Claire," he said quietly, "do you ever feel like we lost something?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I think we both did." It wasn't anger in her voice. It's just truth. And that truth hit harder than guilt ever could. Ethan wanted to tell her everything about Melissa, about how close he had come to crossing a line, about how he'd almost lost himself chasing the feeling of being seen again. But he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he said, "I want to fix this. I want us back." Claire's eyes softened, but there was pain too. "Then you have to let go of whatever's standing between us." He nodded slowly, and that's when he realized letting go wouldn't just mean ending something. It would mean breaking the comfort of what had become his escape. He went to bed that night with 2 truths. Echoing in his mind, he loved his wife. But he had also found something real, even if it was wrong. The next morning, he woke up early, sat at the kitchen table, and looked out the window at the gray sky. He thought about the dare that started it all, 5 minutes. That had changed his entire world, and he knew that the real test wasn't about what he felt. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be next. Ethan woke up the next morning with a heavy calm. The world outside his window looked peaceful, gray sky, quiet streets, soft drizzle tapping on the glass. But inside him, everything felt unsettled. He knew what he had to do, though part of him wished he didn't. He couldn't keep living in 2 halves, one loyal, one lost. Melissa had been right. There shouldn't be an us. And yet ending it would mean saying goodbye to something that had felt real, something that had made him feel alive again. He sat at the kitchen table long after Claire left for work, his untouched coffee going cold. He looked at his old camera sitting on the counter and realized how much had changed since he'd picked it up again. Taking pictures had reminded him of who he used to be, hopeful, curious, alive. But it wasn't Melissa who had given him that. It was the memory of feeling seen. And that was something he needed to find within his own life, not outside it. That day at the office, everything felt different. Melissa avoided him at first, busying herself with meetings. Their usual rhythm, the small smiles, the inside jokes, was gone. For the first time in months, Ethan felt the silence between them as something necessary. Around lunchtime, he finally walked to her office. She looked up when he entered, her eyes calm but tired, as if she'd been expecting this. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," she replied. There was no anger, no sadness, just understanding. He sat across from her and took a deep breath. "I need to say this, and I don't want to say it wrong. You've been more than a friend to me. You reminded me that I was still a person who could feel things, who could care about life again. But if I keep this going, I'll lose more than I can handle." Melissa nodded slowly. "I know." He looked down, his hands trembling slightly. "You didn't deserve to be part of my confusion. I'm sorry." She smiled, small, sincere. "Don't be sorry for being human. You just got lost for a while. We both did." Ethan swallowed hard. "You told me to take 5. Maybe now it's time for me to take one more to go home, for real this time." Melissa's eyes softened. "Then go. And don't look back unless it's to remember what you learned." They sat in silence for a moment before he stood up. It wasn't dramatic or painful, just real. Two people letting go with quiet respect. Before leaving, he said, "Thank you for everything." Melissa nodded. "Go make it right." And that was it. No tears, no promises, just an ending that felt like a beginning of something better. That evening, Ethan drove home through the fading light. He passed the same streets he'd driven countless times, but they looked different now, brighter somehow. He realized how easily we forget to notice the beauty in everyday life until someone reminds us. He didn't need Melissa to do that anymore. He needed to choose it for himself. When he walked into the house, Claire was in the kitchen cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and butter filled the air. She looked surprised to see him home early. "You're home before sunset." "That's new," she said with a half smile. "Yeah," he said, hanging his jacket. "I wanted to be." She nodded and went back to stirring the pan. He stood there for a while watching her, realizing how many evenings he'd walked right past her without noticing this simple grace in how she moved. How much love lived quietly in her small routines. "Can I help?" he asked suddenly. Claire looked up, amused. "Help? Since when do you cook?" He smiled. "Since today." She handed him a knife and an onion. "All right, Mr. Chef, let's see what you've got." As they cooked together, the tension that had filled their home for months began to ease, little by little. They talked not about bills or chores, but about random things. The neighbor's new dog, a show they used to love, an old vacation memory. It felt simple, ordinary, but sometimes ordinary is exactly what's missing. After dinner, they sat on the couch quietly watching the fire flicker. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. The same woman who had been by his side through everything, who had built a life with him. "Even when things weren't easy, Claire," he said softly, "I haven't been the man you deserve lately." She turned to him, her expression wary but calm. "You've been distant, yeah? But I figured it was stress. Was more than that," he said honestly. "I lost myself. I started forgetting what mattered. But I want to change that. I want us back." She studied his face for a moment. "Ethan, I don't need grand promises. I just need you to show up again. That's all I've ever wanted." He nodded, feeling both relief and guilt. "Then that's what I'll do." She smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. "Good, because I missed you." For the first time in months, they hugged. Not out of habit, but out of something real. And that hug felt like the first breath after a long storm in the days that followed. Ethan worked on rebuilding what he had neglected. He put his phone away during dinners, took Claire out for drives, and brought back his old camera, suggesting they go to the lake one weekend so he could take pictures again. Claire agreed, and for the first time, her eyes lit up the way they used to at work. Things were different too. He and Melissa stayed polite, professional, but distant. It wasn't awkward, just quietly respectful. They both understood what had been and what it needed to become. One afternoon, while walking past the break room, Melissa looked up from her coffee and smiled at him. "Taking 5," she said with a small grin. He smiled back. "Yeah, but this time, I'm taking it home." That was the last real conversation they ever had, and it was enough. Months passed, and the tension that had once filled Ethan's life faded away. He and Claire grew closer again. Not perfect, but better, more honest. They started planning trips, laughing more, remembering what it felt like to be teammates instead of roommates. Ethan realized that love wasn't about constant excitement. It was about choosing someone again and again, even when it wasn't easy. One evening they sat by the lake where they'd gone in their early years together. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Ethan lifted his camera and took a picture of Claire as she laughed at something he said. When he looked at the photo, he felt peace, the kind that comes from knowing you almost lost something priceless. But didn't. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're smiling like you used to," she said softly. He smiled wider. "Maybe I've finally remembered how." She took his hand. "Don't forget again." "I won't," he promised. That night, as they drove home, Ethan thought about everything that had happened. The coffee shop, the rain, the laughter, the guilt. It had all started with a dare. Take 5. 5 minutes that had almost changed everything. But in the end, it had led him back to where he truly belonged. He realized that sometimes life gives you moments not to tempt you, but to test you, to remind you of what's real, what's worth keeping, and what's worth letting go. Ethan never saw Melissa outside of work again. A few months later, she moved to another branch. On her last day, she left a small note on his desk. It said, "5 minutes can change your life. Thank you for proving it can also save one." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his wallet, not as a memory of temptation, but as a reminder of redemption years later. He and Claire would look back at that time as a turning point, the quiet, unspoken chapter that almost ended them, but instead made them stronger. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was honest now, and that honesty was worth everything, every so often. When life grew too heavy or routine tried to pull him back into that gray stillness, Ethan would step outside, take a deep breath, and whisper to himself with a small smile, "Take 5." Only this time, he didn't need anyone else to tell him how.